Hi, everyone. I thought everyone would be at the PVKK talk, so thank you very much for coming and not going to the Planetenverteidigungskanonenkommandants talk. I really do appreciate you coming over here. Considering the room is full, doors locked or closed, doors closed. No, we're gonna do a workshop here about tool design, and you're stuck here with me. No, we're gonna be doing that. We're gonna start a little bit early. That gives us a little bit more time as well. Originally, this was planned for 2 hours, but it got cut down to 1 hour to make time for things. So if we can't get through it fully, we'll know why. But I'll try to pace it a little bit here and there, kind of like see how we can get through it. I'm gonna call on people sometimes, but this, as you can see, this light is very bright. So I might have to ask you just like raise your hand sometimes if I call upon you. There's no laptops necessary, but if you want to make notes or write things down, of course, absolutely go for it. All right, let's get started. So yeah, seeing the forest for the trees, how to think about workflows when designing tools. So first of all, who am I? Who is this guy standing in front of you? I'm Robin-Yann Storm. I used to work at indie studios on games for console and PC. I was then a co-founder of an indie studio for a little bit of time. I then went into freelancing and consulting as a tool designer, specifically the user experiences of tools. I then worked as a tool designer in the AAA industry at IO Interactive on Glacier 2. Then I worked at a tool designer in AAA industry at Guerrilla Games on Decima, which the Horizon games are built in Amsterdam. And then I worked as a tool designer at Apple for a few years in California. And now I am back to being a workflow consultant and freelance tool designer. So what's the agenda for today? What are we going to do? We're going to do 2 sections. First section is workflows versus tools. We're going to do a couple of slides, and do some explanation, and then we're going to move into a couple of exercises that we're going to do individually and then later as a group. And then we're going to move into the second section, asking why. Again, a couple of slides, and then again, some exercises. I've heard some people already, like they're a little bit overwhelmed with everything that's going on. You're not forced to participate. If you're just watching, that's fine as well. But if you can't participate, I would highly recommend it. It can be very helpful to learn more about tool design. So let's get started with workflows versus tools. And the important thing to start out with is that there's no such thing as an average level designer. No such thing. You can remove that average. There's really a level designer or level designers, the ones that you're working with. For example, if you are a level designer yourself, what kind of level designer are you? So on the left side, we have a couple of tools like geometry tooling, material tooling, narrative tooling, combat tooling, 3D art tooling, lighting tooling, and scripting tooling. At the bottom, we have whether we need this more or less within a particular workflow. So less on the left and more on the right. So let's say, like, level designer 1, the way that they like to work, the way that they need to do things for their game, might not involve a lot of geometry work, not a lot of material work, but it can involve a lot of narrative tooling that they need to do. Not a lot of combat tooling, but a lot of 3D art tooling, like asset browsers and material editors, those kinds of things, right? They might not need to do a lot of lighting tooling, like place a light here and there, make sure things are like RGB set correctly, but that's about it, quite simple. And then scripting. They might do a little bit of scripting, not a lot of node graphing maybe, but like not that often. Well, level designer 2, on the other hand, maybe on the same project, maybe on a different project, of course, may need to do a lot of geometry tooling, right? There's people who love, for example, like using Hammer and BSP and CSG kind of tooling to make levels entirely by themselves. They're great at doing that. They might also do a lot of material work. They might be great at making shaders and putting those on geometry, right? They might not do a lot of narrative work, though, but that's fine. They might do a lot of combat work. They love putting NPCs in the right places, setting spawn points, making sure combat is really fun. But they might not be that great at 3D art. They don't want to do much of it. They don't want to make it look good. They just want to make it play fun, and that's fine. But they might do a lot of lighting to make sure the player knows where to go and that things look beautiful, like from just like a lighting perspective without doing a lot of modeling. And then scripting. They might do a lot of scripting to make that combat really, really good. Right? So what would be the average level designer? It'd be this one in the middle, right? But that doesn't exist. There's no one who fits like exactly in the middle, like, oh, they do everything a little bit. Different people do different things with the tooling. So the first thing that we need to know here is that users think and work in unexpected ways. There's no perfectly average workflow. You see this as well when people, for example, try to build an editor or a tool, and they're like, oh, the hierarchy needs to be on the left, for example. But if you open up like Unreal, Unity, and a lot of other like Maya, 3ds Max, that hierarchy can be left or right. Like it differs between these packages. There's no like perfect average that you can use. So it's not just different for each user, it's also different for each task, right? The important thing is to don't think per tool, but think per workflow instead. So, for example, what do you need to block out a combat area? Same kind of graphing, right? So for the workflow needs, you might need a lot of geometry tooling, not a lot of material tooling, not a lot of narrative tooling, bunch of combat tooling, not a lot of 3D art, a little bit of lighting, and a bunch of scripting. That's totally fine. So now we've blocked out this area, we've blocked out a combat area, and we can play test that, right? But what if we now want to polish that area? That changes, right? All these things shift around. So you have the same person now using different tools for the exact same area. They might do a lot more with materials and a lot more 3D art and a lot of lighting, but a lot less narrative. That's fine. And now, what if a friendly NPC gets added after combat? Like, someone comes in and goes, great, now we want an NPC to come into you after combat. What changes now? Well, again, these things change, right? Now, there's a lot of narrative tooling that's not necessary, not a lot of material tooling, but still some geometry because we all know those NPCs get clipping errors and get stuck all over the place. Like, it happens. So you might still need a lot of that. So it's important in the case to don't think per tool, but think per workflow. So instead of thinking about like the geometry tool, the shader graph, the scripting tool, the terrain tool, the lighting tool, and the dialogue tool as all these different things, instead think about the workflows of how people use them. It's much more that they kind of mesh together. And within those overlaps, you get something like that combat workflow, that narrative workflow, the gray boxing workflow, the cinematic workflow. So don't think of tools individually, but think of them within workflow contexts. How do you use those tools together when you need to do a particular thing? A really like clear example that I use a lot in the consulting that I do is, for example, an asset browser and a level editor. If you find assets, you want to drag those right into the level, and then you want a gizmo or some kind of lighting to appear to instantly move that object, right? So that's the asset browser and the level editor working together to create a workflow. If you only work on the level editor and the asset browser separately, you're not going to be able to do nice, good workflowy things like that. It's in the combination of them that a good workflow appears. So what are the tools and what are the workflows that will be used? Let's do some exercises. Let's just go through this, go through a couple, kind of see what we come up with. So we saw this graph earlier, right? Let me just like remove the tooling on the left and move everything back to 1. In this case, what I would like you to do just for like 5 minutes, just write it down on paper or just like write it down on your phone, something digital. Write down what tools you think would be needed for a particular workflow and how much that would be needed in that workflow. So 1 is not used a lot, so like it still will be used, but not a lot. And 5, it's going to be used very, very heavily in that particular workflow. So let's just go through that, and then afterwards, I'll call in a couple of people, and we'll talk a little bit through about different ways that people can work. So let's go, and the first workflow is animating the main character. What kind of tools do you think that would need, and how much would they be used for that particular workflow? Just write some down. The question was like, hey, is it just about the knowledge of what the person's doing? Is like the specific, like the tools that they're using? This is about the tools that they are using. They might have a lot of knowledge about a lot of different things, but purely think about the tooling that they're using. Is it like level editing tools, property panels, material editors, animation timelines? What kind of tooling do they use, and how much do you think they would need that to do that particular workflow, animating the main character? All right, let's go through a couple of folks. So, Cherry? Would you give us a little bit of an idea of like which ones you think would fit? Let me get this on the recording as well.
Of course. To start off, you need at least a tool in which you can set states and in which you can keep keyframes.
Okay, so keyframes and states. Anything else that you're thinking about?
I'll leave everything else for someone else.
No, wait. What else?
Events.
Events, states, those kinds of things.
Exactly.
Okay, so are you talking about like a node graphy kind of thing?
Yes, it is kind of well, for the states, at least it's a node graph. Mm-hmm. And for the keyframes, it's just a timeline.
Okay, so give us a timeline. And what kind of number would you give to that? Would
that
be like
at least
main use case?
Yes, 5.
Like 5.
All of them 5.
All of them 5. Are there any 1s or 2s that you can think of?
Based on the events, you can trigger new things, and those will be smaller. For example, if you want to play a certain audio or audio clip at the moment, those I would put lower. And those will be like a 1 or maybe a 3.
Awesome, thank you very much. And that's a great example that not that often, honestly, comes up with, for example, when you're animating a character, footsteps. Do you have audio tooling that allows that to work with animation? Is there anyone else here who also thought of audio tooling in this particular exercise? Awesome. You see a couple of hands, right? It's something that's really easy to forget when you're thinking about something where it's just like, oh, you're just thinking about Maya, animation timelines, but like audio is directly integrated into those things. Otherwise, how's the main character going to sound or like do anything cool with this? All right, anyone else? Anyone else that wants to share their list of things? Yes, I see a hand over there.
Same as the audio, maybe some visual effects tools that you want to add for certain animations, especially when it's a magic-heavy game. You want that stuff, so maybe also 2 or 3 on that. You might also rely heavily on importer tools, especially when your assets are produced in external tools. You need to make sure that the importing workflow is very sound.
I'm going to work with that pun over there, that the importing workflow needs to be sound, because that's exactly it. Like the importing workflow is not just the models and animations, it's also the sounds, right? Like it's those things together that you need to implement sometimes. Like, for example, especially when nowadays we look at something like the USD, Universal Scene Description file formats, you can have a lot of references to a lot of different things that need to be imported all in one go. Like we see more and more and more that people are putting entire characters, entire levels, they built that in some DCC, like Blender, for example, and they export it wholesale and then work with it in an editor. Like it sometimes still happens. Not everyone works in Unreal and builds everything in Unreal. Sometimes they build it outside of it and then imports that, right? So that kind of importing workflow needs to not just think about animations, but also about sounds, also about these other things. Anyone else? Anyone else that wants to share? Yes, I see a hand over there. And after that, I'll get to you.
Yeah, like the actual game client, right? And the debugging tools attached to it, right? Like not everybody's using something that's like what you see is what you get. And for something as important as the player animation, like you want to see it run in the client. And so being able to like jump into that client and maybe trigger those states really quickly and iterate in that way is super important too. So 3, 4, but very dependent on the tools you're using, right?
Awesome. Yes, great point. Like it's in the testing as well, like of the main character, right? Like let's say you've animated that main character, but does it react to, for example, getting close to a wall, and does the hand need to stick to that? We see that more and more in recent games, right? And that's the kind of thing that you do want to do with testing. So it might be, for example, lower on the workflow need, but geometry tooling to build geometry or a gym, right? A lot of games use gyms for that. You build a little obstacle course, and now you can run the character to that to kind of see like, oh, are they animating correctly? Are they touching things correctly? Are they bumping into things correctly? Are they jumping over things correctly? Like that's still part of animating that main character. You need that kind of testing environment. And of course, debug tooling, which, just as a slight spoiler, you can pretty much add to all the workflows we're about to go through. Like debug tooling is always important. Okay, one more over there, and I'll move on to the next one.
Yes, I've got a couple of things because I actually tried doing this recently. One is like bone transform gizmos for 3D characters. This is something we were missing at some point. You know, being able to hop into a part of animation and select a bone, move it, adjust it. Not always something you have. A curve editor for interpolating and transitions and whatnot. And also an animation layering tool so that you can layer different animations together, like, you know, characters walking but also swinging a sword or something like that, and so that that also makes sense to people editing that. And so the bone transform gizmo, actually I gave a 5 for at least a 3D, like assuming a 3D character. Curve editor maybe a 2, layering maybe it's a 3 or a 4 depending how complex the system is.
Awesome. Thank you very much. No, those are absolutely great points. And I think it also ties in some of the state machines that we were talking about earlier, right? Where it's like a lot of games, like from the last, like, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, they have these separate systems, right? Like there's animations for walking, and there's animations for shooting, and animation for something else, and you blend those together, big old blend tree of all kinds of animations, and that then works correctly. Which comes back to that state machine thing of like having those things work together efficiently and nicely is really, really important. Like those things tie into animating the main character. It's not just I grab Maya and I animate and I have a timeline. There's a lot of things that come into these other, which is come together into these things. All right, so in this case, does anyone have any further questions on this one? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next one. No questions. Okay, cool. Then for the next one, I want to do this as one big group. We're just going to shout them out and work together with this one. So this is building a boss fight. I'm not going to give you any limitations of like, oh, is this 2D, is this 3D, what does this look like? Like, what kind of tooling do you think would be really important when you're building a boss fight? Any hands? Any hands? Yes, in the back. So cutscene animation manager. So is that like before you start the boss fight, those kinds of things? Great point. Yeah, so phase transition. When you go like especially with the Final Fantasy bosses, they really love doing this thing, right? Where like you play through a little bit and then at 25% health, at 50% health, suddenly there's a big cinematic. You need to make something else work. And then afterwards, the players all need to be in the correct spots again, right? A big thing that I see happen with a lot of games that get in trouble later on when they only think about this problem space later is that when that cinematic happens, everything needs to stop. Right? Time needs to stop. During that cinematic, you don't want the player to die. You'd be surprised how often that still happens in game development, where people are like, oh yeah, we need to stop everything. Oh, we need to do that with every single feature we built. We didn't think of that beforehand. Now we're stuck. And good luck rewriting all those features. Like if you didn't make some kind of time manager before you started doing this, you're in big trouble now, right? And this is just like, we're not looking at a document here, like that explains what is the boss fight we're gonna do. Like we don't have any documentation. We're just thinking top of our heads and think already of like how much problems we could have prevented just by thinking about the thing of just like, okay, when we're doing this thing, what kind of tooling could appear? Now, of course, that doesn't mean we have to build that tooling. We could also say we're not doing cinematics in the middle of a boss fight, which is great. Then you've saved yourself a lot of time. But you've made the decision. Right? Like you've made the decision, we're not doing that because we thought about this, because we're thinking about all these workflows. Like a cinematic kind of tool might be important for a boss fight. How do we work with that? Anyone else? Any other points? Yes?
Like some sort of decision tree to know like how the boss reacts to player movements or interactions. So if you want to expand that later on and scale it, that you don't have to hard code everything.
So you're talking about like a node graphy kind of thing, like.
For example, can be code, can be node graph, but in a way that you can basically script certain interactions with the boss.
Yeah, like you want to see the interactions, see what it does, see what it could do.
Too far to the left, the boss will launch this sort of attack and so on.
Yep, exactly. Another really, really good one, because again, one that I see quite often is that, like, oh my God, I've seen this quite a few times, and it's a shame because. Especially with level designers and QA particularly, when they need to test a boss fight, you know how many times they go through the first like 80 to 90% for testing? Quite often, again and again and again and again and again. To get to the last 10%, they get bored at the end. Or even at some point, they put on the dev tooling, they put on like the really awesome 99 damage sword and they just cut through it, which is like, yeah, really quick, they get through it, but is it being properly tested? Not anymore. Then a real player plays through it, it takes longer than 10 minutes, and suddenly the whole thing crashes because there was some memory bug or something that was unfound. So that kind of testing where you can like look at what kind of attacks does this thing have, how does this work, becomes really, really important, again, to prevent all these issues later on. And if you're like, hey, again, that sounds like way too much work like of a tool for us to make, cool, then don't do it, but now you know it could be something that you need to look out for when you're play testing this boss fight. Because you don't want to play through the whole thing again and again and again. You're going to be really tired of that very quickly. Anyone else? Any other hands? Yes.
In my mind, it's going to include the use of the same assets that were used in the level previous to the boss fight, like all of that. And so as someone who might be working on the boss fight but not working on the regular level, or they're working on all the boss fights but they're not working on that, so pulling in those resources, so having some kind of particle selector, projectile selector, spawning in entities from the level into the boss fight, and having to, if there were a change to the particle that before it was ice and now it's fire, like all of these things have to be either easily changeable or something like that. So make sure that it's still cohesive with the level. Yeah.
That's a great point. Like a big thing that I also on my website you can find an article about it, which is the critical flaw of asset browsers. The critical flaw is that you need to remember the names of the assets. Like if you have those assets that are like good luck finding that like one asset that you need because you've abbreviated everything to keep it short, right? And even then, if you put real names to it, like wooden door, the problem that I've seen multiple times is like, oh, what if there's like a door that looks kind of like really solid and metal-y? Like I see it in game, and I'm like, great, I want to use that as well for like building my level. So I look for a metal door. I can't find it. I look for iron door. No, I can't find it either. Oh, it's called steel door. Okay. Like it's those kinds of things, right? Like, and a big thing that's really helpful in this case is like, yeah, having a way to kind of go like, hey, this boss fight is in the jungle level. Let's put it that way, right? So when I have a whole bunch of assets that I want to use for that boss fight, for the particles that it has, for the audio that it has, for the assets that I want to place in that boss fight area, right? I want to be able to search for jungle and find those assets so I can work with that easily. Again, we've bridged these toolings together to create a workflow that makes it much, much easier to work with these things and prevent problems in the future. Okay, one last one before we switch over to the next one. Yes.
Thank you. One thing that might be very useful is like in the 3D view, you usually see like geometry, and being able to switch, I don't know, from like solid geometry to like just seeing like the encounters or triggers you have for like a boss enemy or something like that. So like I, as a level designer, maybe want to see the geometry, but like the person that designs the encounters or NPCs just sees like the encounters and where they are placed in the map.
Awesome. Like, yeah, debug tooling and gizmos, like seeing what's in the world, right? That's slightly touching on something we want to see in the future. Remember that for a future exercise that we're going to do in chapter 2. Because yeah, like seeing where those things are and seeing where they're going to be located, right? Again, if you want to play through that boss fight to then see where that boss is doing those fire pillar attacks, right? You don't want to have to play through it every single time to see where those fire pillars are. You just want to look in the editor and kind of go, oh, there's a little thing here. That's where that fire pillar is. It's in the middle of a hole or something. Let me just move that away. Again, it's simplistic stuff, but it's really important. And also, of course, we have multiple different people doing different work in the same area, right? If everyone sees all the collision, all the triggers, all these things, not everyone needs that. I'm going to tell you that like a lighting artist doesn't want to see any of that. They just want to see, does this thing look really cool? They want to be able to turn off all that debug information. Valid case as well. Still really important for like building a boss fight, right? Like they want that boss fight area to look really, really cool, but it does mean you need to be able to like to turn off all the debugging that the other people do need. Okay, one more hand and then we're going to move on to the next one.
What you just said reminded me something that I like to think of when I try to build tools, which is when there's something that's like not immediately obvious when you're editing, but might really break the game. It's also nice to put in errors, warnings, assertions, that kind of thing, to warn somebody editing what they're working on that, hey, the interaction of these two things is pretty dangerous. You might want to look at this.
Exactly, that's a good point. Like just like notations, comments. Like, for example, like when you're writing code, you will be asked to write comments, right? To like showcase like, hey, this is what the thing is going to do. This is what this thing is going to do. If you're working with Blueprint and Unreal, there's comment nodes. You can make a comment section and kind of go, hey, this is for shifting gears. This is for like pressing the gas pedal. Like even having those kinds of things like commenting nodes, it does not directly build the boss fight. But the thing is, like, I don't know, like 20% of building a game is putting the content in, like the initial building, and then the rest of the 80% is the constant iteration. So yeah, you can get away with not having any comment system, but that 80% is going to be really difficult for you in the future, especially when you're working on a game like, 4 years, like full time in AAA especially. Like that stuff gets really, really, really complicated. All right, we got to move on to the next one. And this one, please do with the person that you're sitting with at the table. Just like write things down together, discuss these things together. I think I found some music, so I'll turn that on. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is fixing AI bugs on an NPC. What kind of tooling would that need? How much do you think that's necessary? Think about it. Thank you all very much for going through that. We're gonna, folks, we gotta move on because we still have more things to go through. But I'm loving that everyone's having lively conversation. Like also, of course, feel free to connect with a person at your table and talk more after this workshop, right? Like talk to each other. This is a great fun thing to just chat with people about. Now, I was talking to one table over there who said they had some interesting ideas. So what were you thinking about?
We didn't say it was interesting, but we had some ideas. So displaying state, displaying navigation, so where the NPC is, where they're going, forcing them in a specific state or specific navigation or specific location. Continuous telemetry, so where have they been, basically. And the other one we had is like coverage in tests. So basically automating the scenario that you want to solve for and rerun automatically.
Awesome, like smoke testing, that stuff, like having it continually running overnight and those kinds of testing kind of things.
Yeah, could also just specific test scenarios, like whenever you make a change to a level, you can see if it would break, like it would trip a test, basically.
No, that's a great one, like having kind of like similar to a gym, but then an automated gym, right? Like the character's gonna walk past this area, they're gonna fight this thing, they're gonna do that thing, and then you can find out the problem, right? Because through gameplay, a particular scenario might not happen often, right? For example, like, there, for example, is like a game like Hitman. That's why I used to work at IO Interactive. But like, you can get a lot of different states, right? There's a lot of different things that can happen. Like, if those sometimes don't happen quite naturally, weird things might happen. But you do want to account for those happening, right? You don't want to have someone only bump into that issue once in a million times and not know what's going on. Because then when a player does, because like, let's say you have 30 people building your game, right? And 1 million people are going to play your game. Those 1 million people are going to find issues that you, as a 30 people, never found. Like it's simply like looking at numbers. They're going to bump into things that you've never bumped into. So looking out for those things, very, very important. This is a great point. And also, I love your point of navigation, seeing navigation on the ground, seeing where things are going to happen, because we've all played games where NPCs fall through the floor, clip through things, end up behind things, and suddenly the game is soft locked and you're done. And sometimes that can mean like resubmitting to like Sony or Xbox, and that's expensive and costs a lot of time. So something like that could really save you. And again, the point here not is like, hey, let's think of 1,000 things, let's do all of them. The point is, we've thought about it. Is this important to us? Do we need to show navigation? If not, can we simplify this? Instead of free-form navigation, can we just do squares or hexagons? So it's much, much more difficult for an NPC to get stuck somewhere. Cool, great. Now we don't have to do the visualization maybe. We can just have squares and hexagons, and the players don't get stuck, or like the NPCs don't get stuck as often. We've made a decision that could save us a lot of time. All right, this table over here. What did you think of?
So we thought that maybe if your AI runs in a behavior tree and maybe a node-based behavior tree, you want to debug that and not only debug the code, but also be able to stop at a specific transition from one state to another state. That also, if for example, your bug is in a dialogue or something, you want to be able to skip stuff very quickly or use specific cheats to get to the specific point where the bug occurs. And something else that we got is being able to quickly distribute your build to all different machines. So if your bug is OS specific or machine specific, that you can test that quickly.
Exactly. The last one is a really, really good point because, for example, like I use a MacBook. If you make things on Windows or Mac OS, that can be a big difference. So if you are really, really good with having your game on Windows and supplying it to people on Windows, that's great. But if you also want to ship on Mac OS, you gotta find a nice and easy way to instantly get that running on a Mac OS system and then debugging in there. And again, if we don't want to do that, that's fine. But then Mac OS stopped being a platform for you. That could be a choice, but at least it's an active choice you made. It's not like, oh, now we're stuck and we can't run this easily. Again, sometimes these things can be like, oh, duh. It's like, yeah, but how many talks have we seen where someone got stuck? Or how many times have you seen Development where people get stuck because of such things? Just thinking about them can be very, very important. We're halfway through, so I'm going to move on to part 2. So first, finishing off part 1, workflows and tools. The takeaways here are 3 important things. 1, users think and work in unexpected ways. There's no perfectly average workflow. It's not like, oh, everyone works like this. It depends on the person, depends on the project, depends on the team, the culture. There's so many things that can affect this. And 2, don't think of tools individually, but think of them in workflow contexts. It's not like you have the debugger tool, and that's kind of a thing on its own. Debugger is used for what? Debugging which things? How does that tie into those things? Can I debug an asset with that? Can I see the triangle count for an asset instead of the whole level? Where do these things tie in? What is the workflow that I use that debugger in? And 3, design tools with a variety of workflows in mind. There are different things that you're doing. Of course, in this case, I'd love to just have a user sitting here and going through something and we can ask them questions. Because of course, the best way to do these things is by talking to users. But this is a workshop, I can't make a user magically appear. But you see how even just talking to each other, you can find out oh, there's a bunch of stuff that we need to think about when we're making our tools. It's not just for making the content, but then also iterating and debugging further on that content. All right, part 2, asking why? So, an actual request that I have heard in my time working as a tool designer is the translate gizmo needs to be yellow. Okay, so correct question in the case is why? Oh, they're having trouble using the gizmo. Why? Oh, the gizmo is hard to see. Why? Oh, there's too much stuff on top of the gizmo. What do you mean on top? Why? Well, because all the assets near the gizmo are covering it. Why is that? Well, that's because the gizmo is rendered depending on the depth relative to the camera. And as such, before some of the assets on top of it are rendered on screen. So for example, if I have a gizmo like this, right? Have a gizmo, but if it's behind an asset, you're not gonna be able to see it. You can't see the gizmo at the moment. But of course, if you want to move this laptop, you do want to see it. So in that case, seeing the gizmo is important. It needs to be rendered somewhere up top. One of the last few things that's rendered. So that even if it's behind something, you can still move the object, right? So the important thing here is that the original question of the translate gizmo needs to be yellow was actually the gizmo is rendered depending on the depth relative to the camera, and as such, before some of the assets on top of it are rendered on screen. So the user might not know exactly that that's the problem. They only bring up that thing, right? I just want it to be yellow, want it to be easily seen in some way. So it's important to ask those questions to figure out what is the actual issue the user is having, going through those steps. And it can feel very banal. I know it can feel for people who have kids like talking to a 2-year-old. I get it. You keep it, why? But actually going through that process is really, really useful. So always listen to a user's issue, but never take their suggested solution for granted. If someone comes to you with an issue, they have an issue. They always have an issue. It might be easy to solve, it might be hard to solve, but the issue is there. Don't go oh, this is not a problem, or oh, this is dumb. There's a problem there somewhere, but what is the problem? And keep asking why until you find the core of the issue. They have a problem. Should it be solved? That's also a separate question. But what is the actual underlying issue? And that's the thing that we have to take a look at, right? So let's do a couple exercises again. What is the actual problem behind that issue? Let's do some exercises. So I'm going to start off with one. And again, I want people to just individually kind of look at this and write down a couple of things that you think would be the case, going through a why kind of system. All right, so the first one is, I cannot move objects in the scene. Again, it's a real one I actually have had to deal with. Just write some down. Why? All right. Also, there was Airport Lounge by Kevin MacLeod. Kevin MacLeod, I think. He does really lovely music that as long as you annotate that he did it, he does some really, really cool stuff. Recommend. All right, so I cannot move objects in the scene. Who's got a why that they want to mention? Any hands? Yes. I know, Chair, but I called on you before. I'm going to pick some new people.
And I was thinking Godot, a specific scenario like of scenes, for example. So the first one is why, because I cannot select the object. The second why, because the object is inside an external object, like when you have a scene inside a scene. Why? Because it's a recursive object and I need to reuse it, instantiate the scene many times. So why you want to move? In a specific case, I need to move the object inside this other object. So
classic, like the nested objects kind of thing. Where it's like, I want to move this object, but it happens to be a nested object. Great, yeah, that's a great point. Like that's definitely a thing that I've seen happen many times with many editors where nested objects become a big problem with trying to move stuff. Anyone else? Any other hands? Yes, I see one over there. Hold on.
Yeah. So basically, well, I'll just read it. I cannot move objects in the scene. Why? Because I cannot select them. Why? Because they look grayed out. Why? Somebody locked them. Why did they lock them? Because they don't want me to mess up with them. Why? Because if I do, that may cause some issues when we merge. So our level pipeline is broken. Level design pipeline.
That's an awesome point. Like sometimes someone kind of goes like, hey, I really want to do this thing. And it's, as Juan mentioned in the keynote, if you saw it earlier in the morning, sometimes you just got to go, hey, no, just don't do that. Like someone's going to request, I want to move these things. You kind of just go, no, I shouldn't, because we found out actually those things need to stay put. Again, like that, and we can just like kind of go, nope, we're like won't fix, which is great. I love hitting Jira tickets with won't fix because it's a lot less work. It's really lovely. So we're going to move to the next one, but first I want to go through what the actual issue was if I cannot move objects in this scene, because I've used this one before in some talks. Turns out that if you hit spacebar in a particular editor, it would freeze everything, which is kind of like YouTube, right? Like you hit spacebar, you stop any kind of video playback. So everyone constantly accidentally kept hitting the biggest button on the keyboard. Of course you would. But no one knew why or how this happened. So I had to go through the whole company, talk to a whole bunch of folks, and I found out actually it was the rendering engineers. The rendering engineers, they want to pause at really particular moments and then do a bunch of like rendering testing to make sure, like fly around it, do a bunch of things to make sure it looked really cool. So like it was definitely necessary, but people kept locking up because everything would just be completely locked up in the whole scene and you can't work anymore. So the solution was, we'll just make it control spacebar. The rendering people can still use it, but no one can accidentally hit both control and spacebar at the time. That's a very unlikely event to happen. And 90% of the studio was super happy about it. They were like, oh my God, I'm never locking up again. This is lovely. So it's those kinds of things, like just going through that list and finding out what's going on, super duper important. All right, next one. Again, small groups, just talk to the person next to you this time. It's taking too long to find the values that I need in the property panel. Just talk to each other, work at a table together. What could that be? Why? All right, everyone. Okay, all right. I hope you had some fun thinking about a bunch of things that could potentially be happening here. I know it's very moonshot, this kind of workshop, right? Like we don't have I don't have you a game to show you, but even this, again, you can go through it and kind of go, oh, that's a bunch of things that could be happening. I heard some fun ones already going through the room just now, but does anyone have a particular one that they want to share? Where they're like, oh, we found this, or I've actually dealt with this myself. Any hands? Anyone who wants to bring it? Oh, yes.
For the fields for some of our items in the game, they have to be set in the item editor, and some are set in the level editor. So you don't always know, like, oh, is this set in this context or in this context? Two completely different tools, right?
Yep, and that's a classic case of like the tools were built separately with separate ideas for separate things, and it's like, no, actually, when you are building the content, you actually want to touch both properties at the same time. No things are in separate tools, now you're suddenly very, very stuck. Like then it gets very complicated, you have to constantly context switch. Classic one. Again, we see it very often. Anyone else? Any other ones? It's like, oh, I have a interesting one. Yes.
Oh, we started with a small system that we just handled like 2 or 3 variables, and during this time we started to grow the script, and we ended up like having a ton of parameters, and we don't have fields. Like we didn't order it, and now we have, I don't know, player 1, player 2 with and a lot of values. That happened to us.
That makes a lot of sense, which is actually, that is the one that I bumped into. Like the problem was like, hey, we have so many values in the property panel, I can't find the ones that I need to be working with. And there's a lot of solutions you could do here, right? Like you can make like a search bar system and it searches everything, or maybe like some values are named incorrectly and we got to do some work in that. But the actual solution in this case was like, hey, gameplay engineering is still building their stuff. And so that property panel is just going to be filled with things. And they're just experimenting. You can't find things yet. You know what? That's fine. We don't need to do a whole bunch of tooling work to like a search bar system. It's a lot of effort and time. Instead, we just kind of went, you know what? Won't fix for now. And we'll just like, once the gameplay engineers are done with their work, that property panel will be a lot smaller because there'll be fewer values exposed and we don't have any problems at all. Again, just like removed a whole bunch of work just because we looked into it, asked why a couple of times, went through it and found out, cool, no work needs to be done here. All right, and then let's go through the very, very last one. Let's go through this with groups again. So just the person that you're sitting with at your table, which is, I can't find the asset I need. I'm going to give you 5 minutes for this one. We are nearing the end, folks. So I'm just going to go to like 2 or 3 tables and see what people are thinking of. So who here has an interesting story that they want to share for? Oh, I see a hand over there. All right, shoot.
Yeah. So basically, I cannot find the asset I need. Why? It doesn't show up in the search bar. Why? Because it's saved inside a sim file. Why? Because people don't save it, because we don't have a folder structure to store these types of assets. And why? Because we don't test for it and check if someone saved a resource in the scene. So they don't push it into master.
With the amount of laughing I'm hearing around the room, this happens often, doesn't it? It happens a lot. Like you save something in a scene and it's right there and it's cool, but it's not being reused anywhere. It's not a reference anywhere. And so now people are just, making stuff. And it also means that if somewhere else someone does make an actual object out of it that they can reference in multiple places, once they update that, the one saved somewhere else won't update. Again, that happens so often in game development, especially when you have tens of thousands of assets. Again, talking about a huge scale here. One small issue can really create like an avalanche of other issues. Anyone else? Any other hands? Any other whys? Why can't they find the asset they need? Why can't they? Oh, yes, all the way in the back.
I can't find the asset because it wasn't checked out in version control, for example, like GitLFS or something. So you basically have a file with the name on your drive. It looks like that in the normal file explorer, but the engine doesn't detect it because I didn't check it out with GitLFS because someone added I'm on the wrong branch or the wrong version or something. Yeah.
No, that's exactly. And again, I hear laughter in the room because again, it keeps happening, right? Like these kinds of issues keep cropping up and up again and again and again. So when you're making tooling, it's a really difficult, very expensive, time-consuming job. So the more work you can cut to make things that are really important, the better. And the more issues you can anticipate, the better. It's good to think about those things, right? It's good to like look forward to like what kind of things can pop up here. Because if all of us keep dealing with issues of like, oh, did I get the right branch? And there's probably some workflow issues there that we have to take a look at. Like, why does that keep happening for so many people in all these kinds of different ways? What is something that we can do to make that much, much easier? Like, ways that I've seen this done, for example, is like with the classical launcher for an editor, right? Or launcher for a game, where in the launcher, if you click play, it instantly grabs whatever the latest thing is. Not for programmers, of course. They want all kinds of different branches. That's great. But for designers and artists, click play, you get latest, that's going to be latest automatically. You don't have to go through Git, you don't have to go through Perforce, it just does the thing that it needs to do. And yes, setting up a launcher like that is very time consuming for an engineer, but if you have 100 people using that thing, you're saving so much time and so much difficulty and so many bugs that are happening, right? You can save so many things from happening. All right, so we are nearly on time, so I gotta go through this. Like, if we had time left, I was gonna ask, what are some issues you've heard about or dealt with yourself? I've done this workshop before. It's really fun with the war stories that people get. But sadly, we're on time, so I'm going to have to move on. So, part 2, asking why. What are the takeaways here? 1, always listen to a user's issue, but never take the suggested solution for granted. Really important, right? Keep asking why until you find the core of the issue, like what is actually going on. Don't just do what the user says. Find out why are they having this issue. And 3, answer these questions by observing your users and engaging with them, right? Now we just did a thought exercise of like, oh, what are all the things that could be happening? Have those same kind of things in your head when you're talking to that user. It's like, hey, you're having that problem. What are all the different ways that this could be wrong? Like, let's walk through the why. What is happening to you here? Like, ask them those questions. This was just a thought exercise, but you can go through these things. And again, I only had an hour here, so this is just like basics of tool design. I also get like master classes and workshops and more advanced topics. But we can see how even with the basics like this, we've bumped into things that we all deal with, problems that we're running into. I want to give a thanks to these people for giving me feedback on this presentation. And that's it. Thank you very, very much for attending. You can also find me on these websites, and also I'd highly recommend checking out the toolsmiths.org. It's a Discord full of tools people. There's a UX channel in there as well. There's a lot of people talking about tooling in there. Like there's programming, there's UX, all kinds of stuff. Thank you so much.